My name is Mara Thorne, and I am 47 years old. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in a small, quiet home that used to feel like a sanctuary but now often feels like a monument to what I lost. My life, before everything changed, was calm, predictable, filled with the everyday rhythms of a university town. I worked as a librarian, a profession that suited my perceptive nature and my love for order. My greatest joy, my deepest connection, was with my younger sister, Eleanor. She was a light, a vibrant, curious soul who found beauty in every small detail of the world. Eleanor was the person who understood me without words, the one whose laughter could always lift the weight from my shoulders. For years, her health had been a quiet hum in the background of our lives, a chronic condition that we managed with doctors and medication. But then, almost 5 years ago now, that hum grew into a roar. Eleanor was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive neurological disorder. It was a slow, agonizing descent. I watched, helpless, as it systematically stripped her of everything: her ability to walk, then to speak clearly, then to feed herself. The illness devoured her mind, piece by agonizing piece, leaving only glimmers of the Eleanor I knew. My life became a continuous vigil, a desperate fight against an invisible enemy. I exhausted my savings on experimental treatments, spent countless nights researching, advocating, begging for more time, more hope. My job became an afterthought, my friends distant echoes. Eleanor was my world, and that world was shrinking. The people around me, the ones I had known for years, they saw my struggle, but they did not truly see it. They offered platitudes, hollow echoes of empathy that grated against the raw edges of my grief. At the hospital, during those endless waits for test results, nurses and well-meaning visitors would tell me, "She's in God's hands now," or "Everything happens for a reason." Later, after Eleanor was gone, after I had held her hand as her last breath left her, the flood of empty words intensified. The funeral was a blur of polite nods and well-intentioned but utterly devastating phrases. Arthur Finch, my former boss from the university library, a man whose ambition was only outmatched by his superficial cheerfulness, approached me at the reception. He'd barely granted me any flexibility during Eleanor's last months, citing departmental needs. Now he patted my shoulder with a clammy hand, his eyes scanning the room as he spoke. "Mara, my dear, I am so truly sorry for your loss. But look, now you're free. You can finally move on, focus on yourself. It's a new chapter, isn't it? A fresh start." His words hung in the air, a sickeningly sweet perfume of casual cruelty. Free? He thought losing Eleanor, the very core of my being, was freedom. He thought the gaping void in my chest was a new beginning. Then there was Brenda Holloway, a woman I knew through a mutual friend who styled herself as a spiritual life coach and exuded an almost toxic positivity. She cornered me by the urn, her voice a hushed, breathy whisper, her eyes wide and unnervingly bright. "Mara, darling, I know this is hard, but Eleanor's suffering has served a higher purpose. Her journey, your journey, it's all part of the divine plan. You've grown so much through this, haven't you? You'll emerge from this stronger, more enlightened. This pain is merely a stepping stone to your true self." I wanted to scream. There was no divine plan in watching my sister waste away. There was no enlightenment in the endless nights of fear and despair. My pain was not a stepping stone. It was a gaping wound. Richard Vance, a long-time acquaintance from my book club, the kind of man who always had a motivational quote ready, was perhaps the most infuriating. He cornered me near the coffee station, a solicitous frown on his face. "Mara, it's about resilience. You're a strong woman. You just need to pick yourself up, dust yourself off. Don't dwell on the past. Get back out there, join a new club, maybe travel a bit. Time heals all wounds, you just have to let it." Don't dwell? How could I not dwell on the last 5 years, on every memory, on the profound absence of the person who had been my anchor? His words were an eraser, trying to wipe away my suffering as if it were a minor inconvenience. These words, these well-meaning but ultimately invalidating platitudes, they burrowed deep into my grief. They didn't offer comfort. They sharpened the edges of my pain, twisting it into something cold and hard. It wasn't just the grief anymore, it was the outrage. The profound injustice of having my deepest sorrow, my most devastating loss, reduced to a trite phrase, a positive spin, a call to move on. They didn't understand. They couldn't. And in that raw, desolate period after the funeral, a new, dark seed began to grow in the barren landscape of my heart. A seed of something fierce and unyielding. They had wounded me, not just with their thoughtlessness, but by denying the very validity of my grief. They needed to feel something real, something that couldn't be dismissed with a pithy phrase or a forced smile. I began to observe them. not in a casual way, but with the meticulous focus of a predator. I watched Arthur Finch's carefully curated public image as a benevolent, progressive leader. I followed Brenda Holloway's online presence, her endless stream of saccharine affirmations and spiritual workshops. I listened to Richard Vance's podcasts, his booming voice espousing his simplistic views on overcoming adversity. I saw their lives, outwardly perfect, carefully constructed facades of success and wisdom. And I realized their greatest vulnerability was precisely that facade, that unwavering belief in their own rightness and the superficiality of their understanding of human suffering. They believed their own lies, and they inflicted those lies on others. They needed to experience the crushing weight of discomfort, the gnawing unease of a conscience finally pricked, the public exposure of their own hypocrisy. This wasn't about revenge as destruction, it was about revenge as revelation. My initial thoughts were chaotic, fueled by raw emotion, but slowly, meticulously, they began to coalesce into plans. I wouldn't destroy their lives, no. I would simply hold a mirror up to them, a distorted mirror that reflected their own casual cruelty back at them, forcing them to see the ugliness they so blithely projected onto others. They would feel discomfort. They would feel doubt. They would feel the prick of a conscience they thought was unblemished. I knew this journey would be long, fraught with its own challenges, but I also knew I had nothing left to lose. And for those of you out there who feel the quiet burn of injustice, who crave a story where true wrongdoers face their comeuppance, I urge you to subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. The months that followed Aliner's death were not a period of healing, as everyone so kindly suggested. For me, they were a period of hardening, of transformation. I didn't move on. I moved inward, burrowing into the intricate mechanics of their lives. My grief, rather than diminishing, became a wellspring of meticulous, almost scientific focus. The raw pain transmuted into a cold, clear resolve. I became a phantom, observing, analyzing, preparing. Ann Arbor, a town I once considered a comforting home, became my operational ground, a chessboard upon which I would move my pieces. Arthur Finch, my former boss, was the first subject of my intense scrutiny. His online profiles, his professional network, the university's internal memos, even the articles he'd written for local business journals, I devoured them all. Arthur was a man obsessed with appearances, with the narrative of his own success. He'd leveraged his perceived empathy and strategic leadership to climb the ranks, often at the expense of those he considered less committed, like me when Aliner was ill. He was a master of corporate jargon, of abstracting human struggles into resource allocation and operational efficiency. His Achilles heel was his reputation, the carefully constructed image of a compassionate, forward-thinking leader. My plan for Arthur would be surgical, designed to expose the hollowness beneath his polished veneer, to highlight the very casual cruelty he'd shown me by framing my profound loss as freedom. Brenda Holloway, the spiritual life coach, presented a different challenge. Her world was built on a foundation of unyielding positivity, of the notion that all suffering was a lesson, a divine plan. She cultivated a massive online following, hosting webinars and retreats, selling books on unleashing your inner joy and finding purpose in pain. Her brand was her vulnerability. She marketed herself as someone who had transcended her own past difficulties, emerging stronger and more enlightened. But true empathy, true understanding of pain, was conspicuously absent from her toolkit. She offered saccharine platitudes as if they were profound truths, glossing over genuine despair with a forced smile. My aim with Brenda was to force her to confront raw, unadulterated suffering, the kind that defied positive spins, the kind that broke even the most resilient spirits. I wanted to see her carefully constructed spiritual facade crack, to expose the disingenuous nature of her empathy to her own followers. Richard Vance, the resilience guru, was perhaps the most insidious of them all. He built an entire career on advocating for a simplistic, almost aggressive form of moving on. His podcasts and speaking engagements were filled with platitudes about bouncing back, grit, and choosing joy. He seemed to genuinely believe that any prolonged period of grief or despair was a personal failing, a lack of resilience. He preached a gospel of relentless optimism, utterly dismissing the complex, often messy reality of human pain. My revenge on Richard would be subtle, a slow, corrosive process. I wouldn't cause him physical harm, nor would I directly sabotage his career. Instead, I would engineer a situation where he would be forced to experience a form of despair that could not be talked away. A loss so profound and so deeply personal that his own platitudes would mock him, turning his well-rehearsed words into bitter ashes in his mouth. I spent endless hours at my computer, not researching library archives, but delving into the digital footprints of my targets. I learned Arthur's conference schedules, Brenda's retreat locations, Richard's speaking engagements. I discovered their weaknesses: Arthur's desperate need for external validation, Brenda's fear of genuine negativity, Richard's fragile ego masked by overconfidence. I created anonymous email accounts, burner phones, and dummy social media profiles. I started observing their routines, their habits, the people they surrounded themselves with. I learned the names of their colleagues, their clients, their closest friends. Every piece of information was a thread, and I was weaving a tapestry of psychological discomfort. There were moments, of course, when the immense weight of my endeavor threatened to crush me. The loneliness was palpable, a constant companion. Sometimes, I would find myself staring at a leaner's picture, a wave of unbearable grief washing over me, making me question if any of this was worth it, if I was just a bitter woman clinging to a ghost. The despair would set in, a chilling reminder of the raw wound that had initiated this path. But then, I would remember Arthur's condescending pat on my shoulder, Brenda's sickeningly sweet sermon, Richard's dismissive advice. The memory of their words, sharp and unfeeling, would reignite the cold fire in my belly. My pain was real. My loss was real. And their invalidation of it was a profound injustice that needed to be addressed. This was not just for me, it was for Alina, for the quiet dignity of her suffering. My plans began to take shape, intricate and multi-layered. For Arthur, I decided to target his professional image, his carefully cultivated persona as a people-first leader. I discovered he was vying for a prestigious regional leadership award, an honor that would cement his reputation. For Brenda, I would challenge her positive vibes-only philosophy by immersing her in an environment where positivity was not only impossible but offensive. And for Richard, I would orchestrate a scenario where his unwavering optimism would be brutally tested, stripped bare by a personal crisis that his own simplistic solutions could not resolve. Each thread was pulled taut, each knot tied with meticulous care. I was no longer a grieving librarian, I was a strategist, an architect of subtle discomfort. And if you are finding yourself drawn into the intricacies of these interwoven fates, then you absolutely must subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. The execution of my plans began quietly, almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift in the currents around my targets. I was not seeking grand, theatrical gestures, but rather a slow, insidious unraveling, a persistent prickling of their consciences, until their carefully constructed worlds began to feel profoundly uncomfortable. Arthur Finch was my first canvas. He was the head of a new university initiative focused on employee wellness and empathy in leadership. He had a speaking engagement coming up, a keynote address at a major regional conference for university administrators. This was his moment, his chance to shine and secure that prestigious award. I knew he meticulously crafted his speeches, drawing heavily on buzzwords and carefully chosen anecdotes. I also knew his biggest fear was being seen as anything less than perfectly composed and in control. My approach was simple yet effective. I found a public forum where attendees could submit anonymous questions for the keynote speaker. Using my carefully constructed online persona, Concerned Observer, I submitted a series of questions that were ostensibly about the challenges of balancing compassion with organizational efficiency. Each question was crafted to echo Arthur's own language, but twisted slightly to highlight the very hypocrisy he embodied. For example, one read, "Mr. Finch, in your experience, how do leaders truly cultivate an empathetic environment when dealing with employees facing long-term personal crises, especially when their perceived distraction impacts departmental metrics? How do you ensure such employees feel truly valued beyond their immediate utility?" Another question, submitted under a different anonymous handle, queried, "Given the importance of mental health in the workplace, how do you address the perception that some leaders might, perhaps unintentionally, subtly marginalize individuals whose personal struggles are prolonged, seeing them as a burden rather than a human being in need of support?" These were not direct attacks, but carefully calibrated probes, designed to make Arthur sweat. During his keynote, I was there, hidden in the back, watching his face. When the moderator began to read some of the pre-submitted questions, a slight tremor passed through him. When my questions came up, his practiced smile faltered. He launched into vague, non-committal answers, regurgitating corporate platitudes about supporting our people and finding a balance. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Later, during the networking mixer, I anonymously slipped a small, neatly typed card into his jacket pocket. It simply read, "Freedom, a new chapter. Is that what you call it, Arthur?" No name, no return address, just the words he had spoken to me at a leaner's funeral, thrown back at him. I watched from a distance as he found the card, his brow furrowing, a flicker of genuine discomfort crossing his face. He didn't know who I was, but he knew the words, and their unexpected appearance disturbed his carefully constructed piece. The whispers of concerned observer continued through the university channels, gently fanning the flames of subtle doubt about his empathy and leadership. His bid for the award, I noted with quiet satisfaction, became significantly less certain. Brenda Holloway was next. Her annual Radiant Spirit Retreat was held at a picturesque, secluded lodge in northern Michigan. It was an event designed to uplift, to cleanse, to fill attendees with positive vibrations. My plan for Brenda was more direct, designed to shatter her carefully curated bubble of enforced optimism. I had quietly observed a small, local charity called Sanctuary for Lost Souls, which provided end-of-life care for abandoned and terminally ill animals. It was a place of quiet, dignified suffering, a far cry from Brenda's world of sun-drenched affirmations. Through an anonymous donation and careful communication, I arranged for Sanctuary for Lost Souls to be the chosen charity for the community outreach portion of Brenda's retreat. Brenda, always keen for a public relations opportunity to showcase her compassion, agreed enthusiastically, envisioning attendees communing with fluffy puppies and purring kittens. What she wasn't prepared for was the reality. I had specifically requested that the retreat participants be given the task of cleaning and comforting the animals in hospice care, those in the final stages of their lives, suffering from chronic pain, disfigurement, and incurable diseases. I attended the retreat as a paying participant, observing with unflinching eyes. The day arrived, crisp and cold. Brenda, dressed in flowing linen, gathered her disciples. "Today," she chirped, "we connect with the purest love. We bring our radiant spirit to these beautiful creatures." They arrived at the sanctuary, expecting a heartwarming photo shoot. Instead, they were led to a quiet wing where old dogs lay whimpering, cats with missing limbs purred weakly, and rabbits trembled with pain. The air was thick with the faint scent of antiseptic and animal suffering, a stark contrast to the aromatherapy oils and incense of the retreat center. Brenda, initially unfazed, tried to offer her usual platitudes. She bent over a frail, three-legged dog, stroking its matted fur. "See, darling, this little one is transmuting its pain into love. Such a brave soul." But then, the dog let out a low, guttural cry of distress. A volunteer quietly explained that the dog was in severe discomfort and its time was short. Brenda's smile faltered. She moved to a cage where a cat with tumors bulging from its neck struggled to breathe. "Oh, the universe has a plan for you, sweetie," she cooed, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. The cat merely looked at her with clouded, pain-filled eyes. As the hours passed, the forced cheerfulness among the retreat participants evaporated. They saw the quiet, endless work of the sanctuary volunteers, who offered no platitudes, only gentle touches, medication, and the solemn acceptance of inevitable loss. Brenda, flustered, tried to rally them. "Remember, it's about shifting your perspective." Finding the lesson in this raw experience? But her words felt hollow, even to her most devoted followers. I watched as one woman quietly began to weep, holding a skeletal rabbit. Another participant, a normally bubbly young man, stared blankly at a dog too weak to lift its head. This was suffering that could not be spun into a positive affirmation. This was a direct, undeniable confrontation with pain, decay, and death. Later that evening, back at the retreat center, the air was heavy, not with enlightenment but with a palpable discomfort. Brenda tried to lead a reflection session, but her voice was strained. She struggled to find the right words, her usual lexicon of uplifting phrases failing her. "Sometimes," she stammered, "the energy is complex. We must embrace the shadow." Her carefully constructed image as an unwavering beacon of positivity had been irrevocably dented. The silence that followed her weak attempts at consolation was far more powerful than any argument I could have presented. Some participants quietly questioned her in the days that followed, wondering why they felt so profoundly unsettled, so devoid of the promised radiance. I knew my work was done when I saw a few comments on her social media, questions from followers asking about the unusual depth of their recent retreat experience, hinting at the unsettling encounter with raw, unvarnished suffering. Richard Vance, the guru of resilience, was the most delicate operation. His life, like his philosophy, was built on a superficial foundation. He was about to launch his biggest book yet, The Unbreakable Spirit: How to Power Through Anything. He was planning a major book tour, starting with a live broadcast from a prominent local radio station. Richard was a proud man, convinced of his own wisdom. His greatest vulnerability was the integrity of his carefully crafted public image. I began by subtly manipulating his personal sphere. Richard was incredibly proud of his meticulously maintained vintage sports car, a gleaming, cherry-red convertible that he often mentioned in his anecdotes about perseverance. He considered it a symbol of his ability to overcome challenges and achieve his dreams. I spent weeks observing his routine, learning the security measures of his home and garage. My plan involved no physical damage, no direct harm. Instead, I would plant seeds of doubt, a slow-burning psychological assault. Using a highly sophisticated, untraceable drone, I managed to fly it close enough to his garage one night to subtly, almost imperceptibly, manipulate the locking mechanism. Just enough so it looked locked, but could be forced open with minimal effort. The next day, I made an anonymous call to a local car enthusiast forum, mentioning a rumor of a specific, rare vintage car part being stolen from an Ann Arbor garage. I provided just enough misleading details to pique interest without directly implicating Richard's car. A few days later, before his radio broadcast, Richard discovered his garage door slightly ajar, the lock mechanism appearing tampered with. His heart pounded. He rushed to check his beloved car. It was still there, everything seemingly intact. A wave of relief washed over him, but the seed was planted. He spent the entire day checking and rechecking the car, adjusting the alarm, feeling a low hum of anxiety. He mentioned it to his wife, who dismissed it as him being overly paranoid about his car. He dismissed it too, but the feeling lingered. The next week, I escalated. I anonymously sent him a small package, a single, rare, specialized bolt for a vintage car, meticulously polished. It came with no note, no explanation, just that single, unsettling piece. He was baffled, then irritated. Was this a threat? A prank? He still hadn't confirmed any theft, but the implied message was clear. Someone had been close to his prized possession. The casualness of the act, the lack of explanation, was designed to unsettle him, to make him feel a loss of control, a creeping vulnerability that his unbreakable spirit could not easily dismiss. On the day of his live radio broadcast, I knew he would be distracted, his mind not fully on his prepared statements. I had purchased several copies of his new book and planted small, almost invisible sticky notes on random pages. On one, near a passage about embracing uncertainty, I wrote in tiny letters, "Is your garage secure, Richard?" On another, next to a chapter titled The Power of Positive Expectation, I simply wrote, "Lost anything important lately?" These were strategically placed in the books he would be signing and giving away, subtle and unsettling. During the radio interview, he was slightly off, less booming, a little more hesitant. He stumbled over a few words, something highly uncharacteristic for him. The interviewer picked up on it. "Richard, you seem a little distracted today. Everything all right?" He quickly dismissed it, of course, with a practiced laugh. "Just the usual pre-book launch jitters, gotta stay resilient." But I saw it, and I knew the subtle unease was gnawing at him. He couldn't explain the unsettling feeling, the quiet paranoia about his car, the strange bolt, the feeling of being watched. Later, I saw a social media post from a fan who had attended the signing. "Got my copy of The Unbreakable Spirit, signed by Richard Vance today. Loved the book, but found a weird note inside. Random, right?" The photo showed the tiny sticky note with my unsettling question. Other comments followed, from people who had also received weird notes. It wasn't a scandal, not yet, but it was a crack in his facade, a ripple of unease in his perfectly curated world. The unbreakable spirit was starting to feel a little too breakable. My satisfaction wasn't loud or triumphant. It was a deep, quiet hum of vindication. I wasn't just grieving anymore, I was acting. I was forcing these people, one by one, to confront the very pain they had so casually dismissed in me. Arthur Finch, the man who saw my sister's death as freedom, was now feeling the subtle loss of control over his own carefully constructed image, a small but persistent erosion of his sense of professional security. Brenda Holloway, the spiritual guru who preached divine plans for suffering, had been forced to confront raw, unadulterated pain that defied her saccharine affirmations, and her followers were beginning to notice the dissonance. Richard Vance, the resilience expert, was grappling with a creeping paranoia and a loss of personal security, a subtle fear that could not be talked away with platitudes. Eleanor was still gone, of course. Nothing could change that. The void remained. But the burning injustice, the outrage at their casual cruelty, had found an outlet. Their consciences, long dormant, were now, however subtly, being pricked. They were experiencing discomfort, doubt, and a quiet unease they couldn't articulate or dismiss. It was a satisfaction born not of revenge for revenge's sake, but for the quiet, dignified acknowledgement of the pain they had so carelessly invalidated. This was for Eleanor. This was for the profound and beautiful messiness of human suffering that deserved more than a platitude. The culmination of my efforts was not a single, dramatic event, but a series of precise, ongoing pressures that built a growing sense of disquiet in the lives of Arthur, Brenda, and Richard. I didn't want them to suffer as I had, no. I wanted them to understand, however dimly, the profound discomfort of having their carefully constructed narratives and values subtly undermined, exposed as hollow. Arthur Finch's campaign for the prestigious Regional Leadership Award continued, but the air around him had subtly shifted. My anonymous inquiries, disguised as genuine concerns about organizational empathy, had circulated through the university's internal feedback channels. These weren't accusations, but pointed questions that made HR and the awards committee dig deeper into his actual management style, rather than just his impressive PowerPoints. I also leveraged a minor, but telling, incident. During Eleanor's illness, Arthur had once, in an offhand comment to a colleague, called my frequent absences a drain on department resources and an unfortunate personal distraction. I had carefully documented this. Weeks before the award announcement, I anonymously emailed a carefully edited snippet of this conversation, removed from context so it sounded like a general, dismissive comment about struggling employees, to a small, influential online forum for university leadership ethics, framing it as an example of a common, yet problematic managerial mindset. No names were mentioned, but the timing was deliberate. The forum erupted with discussion, not about Arthur specifically, but about the systemic issue of leaders failing to support employees during personal crises. The ethical implications were debated fiercely. Arthur, always sensitive to public perception, found himself on the defensive. He started subtly changing his rhetoric, adding more caveats, more disclaimers about nuance and complexities to his presentations. His once unflappable confidence wavered. When the award nominations were announced, Arthur Finch's name was notably absent. The reason given was vague, citing a preference for a leader with a more consistently demonstrated ground-level approach to empathetic team management. He never knew the precise source of his downfall, but the gnawing doubt, the feeling of having been subtly, invisibly undermined, was clearly evident in his increasingly agitated demeanor. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the freedom he'd spoken of felt suspiciously like a cage built by his own thoughtless words. Brenda Holloway's radiant spirit brand suffered a quieter, yet more insidious erosion. After the Sanctuary for Lost Souls retreat, a few of her more thoughtful followers began to voice their unease, not publicly, but in private messages and quiet discussions. They felt a lingering sense of dissonance, a feeling that Brenda's unwavering positivity felt less like authentic spiritual wisdom and more like a denial of reality. I anonymously created a series of online posts and articles disguised as thoughtful spiritual reflections that subtly critiqued the positive vibes-only culture. These pieces, widely shared within online spiritual communities, advocated for embracing the full spectrum of human emotion, including grief, anger, and despair, as necessary for genuine growth. They highlighted the danger of spiritual bypassing, a term I learned during my research, which describes using spiritual beliefs to avoid dealing with painful emotions. Brenda's response was to double down on her positivity. She launched a new, even more intensely optimistic campaign, dismissing any negative energy as a low vibration. But the questions from her audience persisted, evolving into direct challenges during her live webinars. Brenda, how do you reconcile divine plans with the suffering of innocent children? One commenter asked. Is it always a lesson when someone loses everything they hold dear? Another queried. Her carefully curated responses, once so smooth, became increasingly defensive, even brittle. During one particularly fraught live session, a viewer directly referenced the Sanctuary for Lost Souls experience. I loved the retreat, but I can't stop thinking about that little dog in pain. How do we find the higher purpose in that? Is it a sin to just feel sad? Brenda, flustered, visibly struggled, her usual radiant smile cracking under the pressure. She ended the session abruptly. Her social media engagement declined, and a few key sponsors quietly pulled out. She was not ruined, but her carefully constructed spiritual empire was now founded on shifting sands, the uncomfortable questions echoing in the spaces where her platitudes once reigned supreme. Richard Vance's ordeal culminated during the peak of his book tour. The subtle paranoia I had sown about his vintage car had festered. He became obsessed with its security, checking it constantly, installing new alarms. This obsession, however, led to his ultimate undoing. Knowing his schedule, I discreetly sent a tip to a notorious local car thief known for targeting high-value vehicles, providing vague but enticing details about a vintage sports car with supposedly lax security in his neighborhood. I specifically worded it to emphasize the car's perceived vulnerability, playing on Richard's already heightened anxiety. The thief, seeing an easy mark, made his move. Richard's state-of-the-art alarm system, which he had installed himself, failed. It wasn't my doing, the thief was simply more skilled, or perhaps the stress made Richard overlook a critical step. Regardless, the car was gone. When Richard discovered the empty garage, a profound shock settled over him. This wasn't just a loss, it was a devastating blow to his image, a direct assault on the symbol of his unbreakable spirit, and a deep personal violation. He called the police, but the thief, as predicted, vanished without a trace. The very next day, Richard was scheduled to give a live interview on national television, promoting his book, The Unbreakable Spirit. He arrived pale, visibly shaken, his usual confident swagger replaced by a nervous tremor. The interviewer, unaware of his personal crisis, began with an easy question. Richard, tell us, what's the secret to truly powering through anything life throws at you? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His platitudes, his well-rehearsed wisdom, evaporated in the face of his raw, immediate pain and humiliation. He stammered, struggled for composure, then finally, his voice cracking, he admitted, I don't know right now. Honestly, I'm not sure. The camera captured his raw, unvarnished despair. The resilience guru had crumpled on live television. The irony was devastating. News of his stolen car, combined with his televised breakdown, went viral. His book sales plummeted. His speaking engagements were canceled. His once soaring career, built on simplistic solutions, crashed under the weight of an unsolvable, deeply personal problem. He couldn't pick himself up. He couldn't dust himself off. His own words mocked him, the bitter ashes of his philosophy. I watched it all unfold from my quiet home in Ann Arbor, a profound sense of closure settling over me. There was no wild jubilation, no triumphant cheer, just a deep, quiet satisfaction. Eleanor was still gone. Her absence remained a constant, aching void in my life, but I had honored her. I had taken the casual cruelty, the dismissive platitudes, and I had returned them not as destruction, but as discomfort, as doubt, as the unsettling mirror of their own hypocrisy. Arthur Finch learned the true cost of freedom when it was stripped of his own carefully constructed narrative. Brenda Holloway was forced to confront the unvarnished reality of suffering that could not be spun into a divine plan. Richard Vance, the resilience guru, discovered that some pain cannot be talked away, that some losses leave you utterly, profoundly broken, even when you preach the opposite. My revenge was not about ending their lives, but about disturbing their consciences, about forcing them to grapple with the very human experiences they had so blithely invalidated. And in their discomfort, in their confusion, in their quiet unraveling, I found a measure of peace. The pain of Eleanor's loss will always be with me, a part of my very being. But now, it is accompanied by the quiet strength of having spoken for her, in the only way I knew how. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily.